Well, welcome to another lecture in social neuroscience. This is lecture 23, our first of two lectures on empathy, and these two lectures map on to chapter 14 in the Sapolsky text. What I'll cover today is, first of all, some definitions, get us started, and then we're going to talk about the big picture of empathy. We'll look at perspective taking, sometimes called cognitive empathy. We'll look at experience sharing, which is sometimes known as emotional empathy. And then we'll finish this lecture by putting it all together by looking at Decety's neuroscience model of empathy. So let's look at definitions first. And what I'm getting at here is that a lot of times you'll hear these words all used sort of interchangeably. I do it myself. It's sort of a problem maybe of lay language mixing in with scientific language. But let's just differentiate between empathy and sympathy. It's a subtle difference. Empathy is usually considered the ability to understand the feelings and the motives of others. So the idea here is that you sort of really get yourself into that person's shoes and you can feel what they might be feeling or understand their motives. And sometimes this type of understanding the feelings and motives of others there's a distinction made between cognitive versus emotional empathy, and we'll be talking about what those are in a moment. And then sympathy then would be the feelings of concern that occur when you have feelings about the welfare of others. You're concerned about their welfare. And it doesn't necessarily require empathy in order for you to do this. That is, you could understand that someone else need some food because they're hungry without actually feeling their hunger or trying to put yourselves in their shoes. And one way to kind of keep track of the difference between empathy and sympathy is to think of it this way, that both the ability of teasing and torture involve empathy. That is, in order for you to be really effective at teasing somebody and knowing how it's going to hurt them or how to torture them and to cause them a lot of pain, means that you actually have that ability to understand what makes them feel good or make them laugh or what makes them feel pain. But you don't have to have sympathy in order to tease and torture people, right? So sympathy isn't necessarily, and sometimes maybe even having sympathy will cause you not to want to tease or torture them. Now, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and some experiments that this actually occurs in non-human animals, particularly in non-human primates. And just to kind of get into that, I'll just go ahead and show you a couple of quick examples of this.
In Chicago, the life of a little boy lies in the arms of a 500-pound gorilla. The 3-year-old tumbled 20 feet into the pit at the zoo. Instead of attacking the helpless boy, one ape takes a page out of the Tarzan book. Binti Jua, a 7-year-old female, shoos the other gorillas away and gently cradles the injured child like he's one of her own. Realizing she can't revive the boy, Binti carries his little limp body over to the zookeeper's door, where the boy gets help and later makes a full recovery. Her unbelievable act of love and compassion captured the heart of America. Zookeepers were mystified until they looked into Binti's past.
How old is she?
She's 9 months old, the latest fact.
I watch TV with her.
This cuddly gorilla was raised by humans who videotaped the first 3 years of her life at the San Francisco Zoo. Binti Jua is Swahili for daughter of sunshine. For one little boy in Chicago, Binti Jua was his only ray of hope.
Now, I was in the United States at that time, and I do remember when this story was all the big news of the day. The fact that this gorilla hadn't harmed the child, in fact, brought the child over to where the entrance to the compound was, where the zookeeper would come. And there was just so much discussion about the fact that perhaps gorillas and other non-human primates show empathy, they show concern for us. Isn't this pretty amazing? Like, they're so close to us in other ways. Why wouldn't they also have a lot of empathy? And I will just point out, though, as you can see sort of an allusion there at the end of this, that to the fact that, first of all, Binti Jua wasn't like a regular wild gorilla out there. In fact, Binti Jua had been raised very closely with humans. And so there could be that there was already this sort of consistent attachment to humans that Binti Jua had learned. It also was the fact that very often, if anything fell into the enclosure that was sort of a foreign object, Binti Jua and some of the other gorillas would just regularly take those foreign objects over to where the zookeeper's door was. Like it's that almost like they recognize this doesn't belong here. Maybe you should take it away. And so we don't really know in this case whether or not the gorilla is showing empathy, sympathy for the child, but it sure made a good story at the time. Now, in terms of anecdotes, there's many of those kind of anecdotes, but there's also some experiments that have been done on non-human primates. Here's an example of a study that was published with chimpanzees in 2001. And this researcher, Lisa Parr, conducted a study where she took 3 lab-reared chimps, and she taught them how to use a cursor with a computer monitor. So you can see here that the chimpanzee is looking through outside their little enclosure there to a screen, and that screen shows them a video, and then they can actually move with their joystick to different things. They can move to positive or negative objects, for example. They learn how to control this joystick and how to move things up on the computer screen. And what she did was she presented in this study short video clips of different situations that were very close to what the chimpanzee was used to. And the ones in particular are ones that had to do with a medical checkup. When a veterinarian would come into another chimp's enclosure, so they're watching this video of another chimp who's going to have a veterinarian come and visit them. And when the veterinarian comes, they give that chimp an injection, which is a fairly normal thing that these chimps would have known about. They would have actually had other experiences with veterinarians, and they don't like vets when they come because they can associate them with some sort of pain or unpleasantness. And so this chimpanzee is watching a video clip of another chimpanzee being visited by a veterinarian, and that, of course, that chimpanzee is not enjoying it very much at all. And so you could look at this chimp's face here. It looks pretty still, but one of the things that she reported in the article is that the chimp actually showed a lot of distress, just like the chimp who was being visited by the veterinarian. But the other thing that was interesting here is that Lisa Parr attached electrodes to the chimp's fingertips. I was actually around at that time at Emory University, and I remember Lisa coming to me, and one of the first things she did was try to record skin conductance activity. So she wanted to record electrodermal activity by putting electrodes there on the fingertips and measuring sweating on the skin. That turned out not to be very effective, not something that she could do very well. So another thing that she tried and that she reported in this article was to measure skin temperature from the fingertips. So she had little thermistors that she taped onto the tips of the chimp, while the chimp watched these little short film clips. And what she found was, as opposed to when they were watching other kinds of stories or video clips, that when the chimp was watching this veterinarian visit another chimp's enclosure, you could immediately see the temperature changed on that chimp, and the chimp was showing signs of physiological distress. So what we're showing here is not so much that there's any sort of pro-social behavior happening, but more maybe that the chimp is taking on the perspective or sharing the experience of that other chimp by watching it on a video, just like we humans do when we're watching a movie or a television show. All right, so that's a little bit about sympathy, empathy, and you can see so far I've not really determined very much about which one's which at these particular little examples here with non-human primates. So let's go on to look at this in terms of a big picture, a big psychological picture about how all of it works. Now, this is adapted from Weiss and Sakara, who published a paper in 2021 on empathy and the trends in cognitive sciences. I've just reproduced it here with just a slight modification, but down at the bottom, if we kind of start from the bottom and move our way up, if you kind of think of empathy, overall the empathic response is sort of like being a spotlight of our attention is going to be shown on something or somebody that we're possibly going to have emotional connections to and have an empathic response to. You can see that there are different external factors that could cause us to turn on this system, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. And then depending on what those external factors are and how your motivations are at this point and what your goals are, they could further elaborate and be elaborated by you taking on a perspective of that other individual's particular situation or that animal's, or you could do some experience in sharing or doing both. And then together the experience sharing or the perspective taking can come together and give us empathic concern or sympathy. All right, so it causes us to feel concern for that individual, and therefore we could have an outcome of like pro-social behavior, something positive like help the individual out of that bad situation. Notice if we go right up the middle there, we can skip the experience sharing and the perspective taking by just jumping straight to sympathy, to that empathic concern. So that's also possible here. And you can also see that experience sharing and perspective taking could also lead to pro-social behavior according to this model without any empathic concern. But let's go ahead and just break this down a little bit more. And I just want to highlight just for a second here some of these external factors. So what influences people's empathic responses sort of externally? And what I've done is I've divided these up into what are triggers and elicitors on the left and then moderators on the right. And under triggers and elicitors, you can see I have static target cues or emotional cues. And so examples of things that could trigger our spotlight of empathic concern or this process of empathy would have to do with things like, are they in our group or not? That's what I mean by social category cues. How human they are, how cute they are, how vulnerable that individual is to some harm. And then their emotional cues, their facial expressions, their verbal expressions. Are they crying out? Are they making tears on their face? These are all triggers or elicitors that could cause us to possibly feel empathy. On the right, moderators are things that could influence as well our general response, and these are, again, external. So things like the social status of the person. Are they higher or lower in our social status? What's their reputation like? Are they somebody that we can trust? Are there any danger or competition involved here? Are there any other distractions that could keep me from actually wanting to show empathy? And then relationship factors would include things like how similar is that person to me? Are they a friend versus a stranger? And do I have a history that I can trust this individual? Now, all of these external factors, all of them are going to have some sort of importance. And what I'll do is at the next lecture is I'll talk a little bit about some of these and how they elicit our empathy. But for now, let's just skip ahead and move up that little figure and look at perspective taking in some more detail. Now, perspective taking, as I mentioned to you, is also sometimes known as cognitive empathy. So that's that blue circle over here on the right. So the idea here is that sometimes out there in the world, we're going to want to take someone's perspective or anybody or an animal or whatever it is, a robot, and take its perspective. And so we're going to look at perspective taking first. Now, perspective taking is very much studied in psychology in lots of different hats, that is, in lots of different ways it's been considered. Probably the way that you most likely have encountered perspective taking before is in developmental psychology, where they talk about this in terms of theory of mind, or TOM. And so the idea here is that specifically it's defined as the ability to represent the content of one's own and others' mental states. So like you have some sort of representation about the fact that you know what you think about something or what your viewpoint is, and then you also know what another person's mental viewpoint is, and you can recognize that they're different. That's what we mean by meta-representation or a theory of mind. But more recently, in recent decades, we also talk about this more generally in terms of things like emotion. So like I could say, I better stay away from him. He looks angry. So you've gone ahead and looked at something about that individual there. There's maybe something about his facial expression. You make an inference about that person's emotions from his facial expression, and that's your theory of mind. So you recognize, hey, he looks like he could be angry. Now, I'm not saying that perspective taking here is going to cause you to have empathy. It just means, though, that I have some chance here of possibly inferring his mental state by taking his perspective and trying to look at something about him and making an inference. We could also infer intentions, goals, and desires, like where they're looking, what they're talking about. Now, in social neuroscience, we tend to lump all of these things into theory of mind and talk about it more generally rather than those kind of specific ideas like a meta-representation. Now, where does this theory of mind come from, this perspective taking? And so this is a question about evolution. And Cosmides and Tooby back in 2005 argued that it was a crucial component of group living for humans and some other primates in order for them to cooperate. So this crucial component, again, of cooperation means that we probably could use theory of mind. This would mean that, for example, we'd be able to detect cheaters. So if we're cooperating with each other, we're living in this highly interdependent group, one thing that helps us is to identify people who might not be pulling their weight by putting ourselves in their minds and taking on their perspective to see whether or not we really believe that they're really contributing what they could be contributing. So detecting cheating means that you must be able to detect deception. So it could be that theory of minds evolved in order for us to detect deceivers well, to have a better, maybe an ancestor of ours who had a component of perspective taking was particularly good at then detecting when other people were deceiving them. And because of that ability to deceive them, they were able to pass on their genes and they were able to have offspring. And so that caused us to have, greater and greater refinement of this theory of mind to help us detect that cheating and that deception. So perhaps theory of mind then is this result of this evolutionary pressure. At what point did this occur? Well, the answer may lie in looking at theory of mind in our closest relatives. Chimpanzees are able to deliberately form coalitions and use strategic deception, but they don't consistently show evidence of teaching. They don't seem to recognize that another chimpanzee doesn't know what they know. That is, they don't have a good sense of, you don't really see this perspective, or you don't know how to do this solution, and then reach over and help the other chimpanzee to learn this. And because of that, that shows that they don't really have meta representation. And so chimps can also show things like mirror recognition and symbolic representation, but there isn't much evidence for meta representation. Therefore, one can conclude that chimps have some of the important precursors of theory of mind, but they just can't do the full-on theory of mind that we do. And so the idea is that perhaps theory of mind evolved after the split with with chimps. So maybe 6 million years ago, where we have that evolutionary branch, that split, that sometime since then is when theory of mind involved in our ancestors. So what are some of the kinds of things we can do with theory of mind? We can make affective inferences, like we can try to figure out what another person's feeling is. Now I notice again that I'm trying to distinguish this from experience sharing. So I'm not necessarily feeling that other person's feelings. I'm just going ahead and making a judgment or sort of like a factual inference about what that person's feeling is, maybe from looking at their face, for example. Intentional, that'd be what is another person's intention, goal, or desire. Did they do something deliberately? Did they do it accidentally? And epistemic, which is what is another person's actual knowledge or beliefs. And again, this requires meta-representation. So this might be where we can actually understand that they're seeing the world in a completely different way from us, that they've interpreted this other person's behavior differently from the way we've interpreted it. And so that knowledge or that belief is important in theory of mind. Theory of mind, as I said, is a concept that really grew out of a lot of developmental psychology literature. So you hear developmental psychologists talk about this quite a bit. But it's also been extended to certain populations among adults. It's also looked at as a neurological problem sometimes if a person's had a lesion in a particular part of their brain. So we could look at how you do this. How do you actually measure theory of mind in adults? And so these are all tasks that most of us could just assume, we can assume that most of us who are watching this lecture could do any of these tasks really well. But let's say you're somebody like a neurologist or a neuropsychologist, and you're trying to see whether or not this person who's had a stroke, they had some other sort of disease, maybe they had a brain injury, and you're trying to ascertain whether or not they still have fully functioning theory of mind. How would you do it? Well, 3 possible tasks that have been proposed, that have been used by different groups. In fact, a lot of these groups are actually all connected to Simon Baron-Cohen, who is sort of like the leader in a lot of this stuff on theory of mind in neurological patients. Would be the strange stories task, the faux pas recognition task, and the Charlie and the sweets task. So what is the strange stories task? Well, this was developed back in 1994. And what you do is you get different stories like this. Here's an example. Today, James is going to Claire's house for the first time. He's going over for tea, and he's looking forward to seeing Claire's dog, which she talks about all the time. When James arrives at Claire's house, Claire runs to open the door, and her dog jumps up to greet James. Claire's dog is huge. It's almost as big as James. When James sees Claire's huge dog, he says, "Claire, you haven't got a dog at all. You've got an elephant." All right, so that's the story. So then the question after you've heard that story is it true what James says? So that's the first question. And then you then ask the question, why does James say this? So you can see that it requires a little bit of inference making here about James. Like, does James just really, if he's uttering that you've got an elephant, does he really believe that Claire has an elephant? Or what is he trying to make up? What's the point he's trying to make here about that dog and how big it is or how small it is? Here's another example. Anne's mother has spent a long time cooking Anne's favorite meal, fish and chips. But when she brings it in to Anne, she's watching TV and she doesn't even look up or say thank you. Anne's mother is cross and says, well, that's very nice, isn't it? That's what I call politeness. And then the question would be, is it true what Anne's mother says? Does Anne's mother really think that Anne is being polite? Or why does Anne's mother say this? And can you make an inference about why she might be sarcastic, for example? So you see, these are abilities that most of us would take for granted because we have theory of mind as fully functioning adults. But again, people with neurological deficits or other kinds of problems may not be able to do this kind of theory of mind task. Here's another kind of task that you could do. It's called detecting a faux pas. And so a faux pas happens when someone says something they shouldn't have said accidentally, right? And so understanding a faux pas requires an advanced theory of mind because it requires the simultaneous representation of two mental states: the perspective of the person committing the faux pas and the representation of the second person involved who may feel hurt or irritated by what the first person said. All right, so this is a pretty complex theory of mind task. And so Stone and colleagues in 1998 developed this, reported it. Here's an example of it. So Jeanette bought her friend Anne a crystal bowl for a wedding gift. Anne had a big wedding and there were a lot of presents to keep track of. About a year later, Jeanette was over one night at Anne's for dinner. Jeanette dropped a wine bottle by accident on the crystal bowl and the bowl shattered. "I'm really sorry I've broken the bowl," said Jeanette. "Don't worry," said Anne. "I never liked it anyway. Someone gave it to me for my wedding." Did someone say something they shouldn't have? Now remember that it was Jeanette that actually bought the crystal bowl. So now that Anne has said that, perhaps she shouldn't have said it because it's now going to insult Jeanette. So who said something they shouldn't have said, and why shouldn't they have said it? So the faux pas recognition task is just lots of tasks like this, where lots of scenarios where you would have to try to figure out what the faux pas is and why something shouldn't have been said and how a person might feel. Finally, a very simple kind of task that you can do with children is called the Charlie and the Sweets task. Again, you could do this with adults. You could do it with adult patients that you're worried about. And so you might show them like these 4 different kinds of lollies or sweets, okay? And then the question would be, first of all, you'd ask the child or you ask the adult, which sweet would you like of those 4? Okay, so you could say Kit Kat, Polo, whatever, right? And then you say, here's Charlie. Charlie's looking at the 4 different things. Which sweet do you think Charlie would like? And so you would think the right answer would be Kit Kat. So even if you said Milky Way, you'd understand that Charlie is looking over at Kit Kat and likes something different from you. And so just from the eye gaze, you can make an inference then about whether or not this person shares your same desire, same intent for that particular sweet. So that's another task that can be done across multiple trials and then get a score and see how the person does compared to a group that we might consider to be the normal healthy group. Now, on all 3 of these tasks, keep in mind that passing and failing these tasks is something of some interpretation. That is, passing these tasks is strong evidence that the person has theory of mind ability. All right, so if I gave you those tasks and you passed them, I would assume that you have theory of mind ability. You can do perspective taking. But keep in mind, too, that failing these tasks doesn't necessarily mean that the person doesn't have theory of mind ability. Now, that might seem strange, but think about this. The tasks themselves actually measure multiple abilities. There are a lot of different things going on here in each of these tasks. They're kind of complex, like eye gaze. You'd have to even understand what it means when someone moves their eyes one way or the other, that it tells us something about what they think about, right? And so you might not be very good at just understanding eye gazes or even noticing eyes moving around. So that doesn't mean necessarily you don't have theory of mind ability. That is, you might do poorly on the Charlie and the Sweets task, but maybe be able to understand the faux pas task. So a person also may just lack executive control. They might have problems inhibiting an inappropriate response. And also keep in mind that these stories require memory and sequencing. And so again, if you're talking about a patient who maybe had some neurological damage, perhaps something's going on with their memory retrieval and just how they keep track of stories and narratives. And so it isn't necessarily that the reason why they're failing is because they have poor perspective taking or poor theory of mind. It could also be that they have these other problems. So anyway, all of those things have to be kept in mind and might be why you would want to give multiple tasks of different kinds rather than just like one task to see if I can tell whether or not they have good theory of mind. Now, moving on to the neuroscience part of this, what are some of the possible neurostraits for theory of mind? Well, you can keep in mind then we have evidence from neurological patients who've had damage to different parts of their brain, and therefore you could look at how a particular patient's theory of mind ability is and how it's related to where the damage is. Or you could even do fMRI studies, right? And just look at what parts of the brain might be more active. And so the three possible neural substrates that people tend to focus on are the temporal poles, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the temporal parietal junction. We've talked about all these in previous lectures. The one maybe we haven't talked about very much are the temporal poles. So you can see here we're talking about very anterior part of the temporal lobe here, that tip that's in yellow would be the temporal poles. Both left and right seem to be involved in theory of mind. We've talked a lot about the medial prefrontal cortex in this course is activated when thinking about other people. So you find this a lot when people are taking on the perspectives of other people. And then the temporal parietal junction, or the TPJ, is another key area. Before I move on and talk about experience sharing, I just want to talk very briefly about autism spectrum. Autism spectrum. Before we move on to talking about experience sharing, another aspect about empathy, let's just talk a little bit about autism spectrum disorder. And we know that people with autism spectrum disorders have more impairments on theory of mind tasks. That sort of makes sense, right? So you probably can imagine you're somebody who might be on the spectrum, and they're going to have a little bit of a problem taking on the perspectives of other people. So no wonder why they would not do as well on the theory of mind tasks. And some studies show that adults with ASD have decreased TPJ when they're talking and thinking about other people, whereas other studies have actually showed increased TPJ during these sort of theory of mind tasks. So I would say that the evidence here in terms of how ASD is related to these particular areas is a little bit more conflictual. It's not as well defined yet, but that just gives us a little bit of a signal here that perhaps it's more about the connectivity between the TPGA and the other regions that actually matters. It's not so much that we just focus so much on this domain-specific area and say, hey, TPJ is where the theory of mind is, and there's something that's disrupted there with people with ASD. But it could be that's just more about something about the connections between the TPJ and other regions that actually underlies these differences in theory of mind. All right. Moving on to experience sharing or emotional empathy. This is that other part in yellow here that we could talk about in terms of empathy. So the other one, remember, cognitive empathy or perspective taking is very cognitive sounding, right? It means that I can just take on the perspective of somebody else just by asking them questions, looking at their face and stuff like that, but I don't actually have to feel anything that they're feeling. Experience sharing has this element that's more about like you're really getting yourself into that other person's shoes. And so we're going to have more of like a visceral sort of coupling with them. That is, our bodies are going to be sort of more like them. We're going to put our postures more similar to them. We're really sharing their experience. And then therefore we're sort of recreating whatever they're going through in our minds because of the fact that we're sharing it so well. This is a pretty old idea. Gordon Allport, one of our very first big social psychologists back in the 30s, wrote a really great textbook about social psychology. And in that textbook, he actually had a chapter on empathy. But he talked about empathy from this perspective of experience sharing. And he showed this picture here of this thing called the All Ireland Road Bowls Championship. And so what road bowls is, it sounds like what it is, it's actually you roll a ball down a road, out in a country road. And as you do this out here and doing one of these road bowls, you have all these fans that are watching along with them. And here's this big championship, and one of their star players here who's actually going to roll the bowl. He's roll his ball, bowl a ball down the road here. And you can see how the fans are, as he's winding up to be able to toss that ball, how they really take on his stance. That is, they're kind of like putting their bodies and mimicking it. And this is the thing that Allport was trying to point out, that a lot of times when we talk about empathy, we actually take on the same sort of bodily and facial features as the person who's having the emotional experience. And we kind of then better identify with them because we've sort of put our bodies in the same sort of stance as theirs and experience it that way. So that's an old idea, but it wasn't really until the 1990s that people really thought about this from a neuroscience perspective, and that was with the discovery of mirror neurons, discovered by Rizzolatti and his colleagues in Italy in the 90s. They first started doing this work in the early 90s, and then one of their first big papers on this was published in 1996. Notice it was published in this journal called Cognitive Brain Research, which at the time wasn't one of the top journals. In fact, this is one of those few times where I'm telling you about a really significant finding in social neuroscience, and it wasn't published in Nature. And in fact, Rizzolatti has mentioned in a later article that he tried to publish this paper in Nature, and Nature rejected it. So he ended up putting it in this like lesser known journal when he discovered mirror neurons. So the idea about mirror neurons is that they are neurons that fire when an animal performs an action and when it observes the same action being performed by another animal. So these would be neurons that would be sort of involved perhaps in performing a particular behavior. And then when an animal is seeing another animal performing that behavior and they're really watching it closely, just like the way those humans there in that previous picture are watching this guy bowling down the road, they start to do the same action in their head, and so that neuron fires again when they're watching this other animal perform that behavior. So they mirror the behavior of the other animal as if the observer were performing the action itself. This was actually discovered accidentally in monkeys, and it was specifically in this area of F5. It's sort of basically where their somatosensory strip is. And what they found was they were actually found, like I said, accidentally, that when they would be doing single neuron recording of how animals would reach for a particular piece of food, you can see there in A, they've got a single neuron electrical recording that they're doing here. So they put a probe right into the monkey's brain. And what they want to do is have the monkey reach for like a berry, a piece of food, and then follow where the movement was being tracked in area F5. And what they soon discovered, though, is that just having a human reach there and grab the berry or put the berry down caused that same part of the brain that they happen to be having these electrodes stuck in was also causing it to become active. So even though the human's not another monkey, at least it's doing a behavior that's very similar to what the monkey does when it grabs the berry. So seeing a human with its fingers reach for that berry or that piece of food caused that animal, that monkey, then to fire the same way as if they were actually reaching for that food. Notice in the control condition, you can see what's happening there is that when the human used some a grip, some sort of tool to grab onto the piece of food, it didn't cause the monkey to show that mirror neuron activity. So they didn't actually show that same activity in the F5 as they did when they would reach for the food. So it was that specific thing of grasping for food that the monkey does as well that would cause it to have that mirror neuron response. And so this caused a lot of excitement. People soon found out about this article, started looking at the research, and then finding that it could be replicated in monkeys. It seemed to be a real phenomenon in monkeys. And then the next thing, of course, is to say, well, if it's in monkeys, perhaps we have such neurons in us, and perhaps these mirror neurons are the basis of how we do experience sharing, how we can share emotions and have empathy and so on. And so immediately in the early 2000s, you get a flurry of activity. People are very excited about the mirror neuron system. And there's evidence from EEG, MEG, TMS, fMRI that suggests that there's sort of like an equivalent mirror neuron system in these areas, the superior temporal sulcus, the STS, the inferior parietal lobule and the ventral premodal cortex, and the posterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus. Now, the thing is that in all of these areas, they've showed activation in things that should be like mirror neurons, but they're big, grosser, larger areas here. They're not like the way Rizzolatti and his colleagues did it originally, where they could actually go in there and measure specific neurons, right? So we don't really have the specific neurons because, in fact, in Rizzolatti's research, he could just go a little bit away from those neurons in F5 and find that these other neurons nearby weren't doing the same thing. They weren't anything special about them. So the evidence of this being a really systematic system in humans, that is that this system is really, systematic system, a really definite system in humans is not as strong as we'd like it to be. And Sapolsky goes on about this quite a bit in chapter 14 and talks a little bit about sort of the overexcitement about mirror neurons. Lots of critiques about it. Very difficult to kind of establish, since it's difficult to do the single electron recording the same way that you could do with the monkeys. But one possibility, one way that people have looked at these mirror neurons and tried to show evidence of this is to look at something sort of similar to it. The way that the monkey research was done, they looked at brain activity at the somatosensory strip in humans. And they did this with EEG. So they do this thing called mu suppression as an index of mirror neuron system activity and therefore empathy. All right, so here's how you might do this to try to show this. So the mu rhythm is in something you would see in an EEG. So here's an EEG being recorded from different sites from the human scalp. You can see there's an EKG signal right in the middle there in red. But see where the arrow is, and it's pointing to where it says F4, C4. So there's this area there around the frontal central sites. That's really close to where the somatosensory strip is, the somatosensory cortex. And you can see there's this big wobbly kind of rhythm there. And that is basically alpha activity. Now, alpha in EEG is what happens when the brain is sort of at rest. So at a particular area where you see sort of nice large oscillations like that of alpha activity, that means that that part of the brain doesn't seem to be really active right now. It seems to be resting. So in order to show that it is active, you'd want to see that alpha activity disappear and get tiny, go faster. Okay, because it's recorded over the motor strip, it's called mu. So that's it's very similar to alpha, mu is. And so if we look at that mu there, that you can see that alpha, mu, that big oscillating thing there that's happening, if it starts to get tiny and disappear like you see where it is in other EEG channels, then we would say that part of the signal has been suppressed, okay, that it's not as active anymore. It's not as strong anymore. And if the mu is disappearing or it's being suppressed, that must mean that part of the brain then is becoming more active, right? So if this is our index of rest and that the rest is being suppressed, that would mean that part of the brain is activated. It's more involved in whatever the task is. So this is the thinking behind this study by Perry et al. That was published in 2010, Feeling the Pain of Those Who Are Different from Us, the modulation of an EEG in the mu alpha range. You can see they're kind of riding the fence here between calling it mu, calling it alpha. Like I said, from what I can tell, most of this stuff of where we call it mu could be just called alpha in other research. But here's what they did. They had to use these dense electrodes arrays that they put across the scalp. The ones that they're focused on the most are the ones in circles, okay? And if you kind of count 3 back from the front, okay, the ones that are 3 back from the front, those are central sites. Those are pretty close to where we'd think that the somatosensory strip is, okay? So they're going to record EEG activity there. And if there's nothing actually happening at the somatosensory strip, then it should show us a lot of mu, big oscillations, correct? All right, here's what they actually did. So the participants were 30 healthy students at the University of Chicago or people around there at the University of Chicago. And they would come in one at a time and have their EEG caps put on. And they were told that they're going to be watching these pictures of different people's hands, okay? And that one group of the hands belong to people who suffer from a rare neurological disease that causes them pain when they're touched by a cotton bud, like a Q-tip, but they don't feel any pain when they're touched by a needle. So this is like what you see there under a dissimilar patient. So these are people that because of their rare neurological disease, kind of have the opposite response to touch that most of us would have, right? So they feel that soft little cotton bud being touched to their skin, it feels painful to them. If they feel a needle being pushed into their skin, they don't feel any pain. Now, the people on the left, that's the other group, okay, the similar patients. So these are patients who actually have tinnitus. They have some problem in the ear, and it doesn't have anything to do with their sensitivity to touch and pain. And so the idea here is that these patients, when they get a cotton bud pressed to their skin, it's soft, it doesn't hurt them, there's no pain. But if they have a needle pressed to their skin for that similar patient, they're going to feel pain. So you see, this way, they could go ahead and have the same stimulus being presented to this two hands, just like you see this. But for one group of patients, this means that that's painful. And for the other group of patients, it would mean that it's not painful, depending on whether it's the needle or the cotton bud. So in this study, then, they go ahead and show them 384 trials. They show them in blocks of 8 trials. And here's kind of a block that you'd see an example of it. You'd see a picture of a patient in the first frame of the block, and you were told whether or not that person belonged to the the one that has the sort of dissimilar pain response from you or the similar pain response to you. So you're told which group they're in. Then you're shown some pictures of them having a needle or a cotton bud attached to or touched to their hand. And then you're asked to rate how much pain do you think that person's feeling. And you could rate it from like no pain to a very severe pain. Or you might be asked to go ahead and say, here's a picture of this person's face. Do you think that means that it was when they felt pain or when they didn't feel pain? Or I'm sorry, is this when the needle was touched to their skin, or is it when the cotton bud was touched to their skin? So it's a different kind of task that they would do on some of the blocks. So the idea is you could either rate their pain or figure out which facial expression they should have for that particular touch of that cotton bud or the needle. And it turned out that the participants learned this very easily. So what you can see here is that we have the 4 types of stimuli that could be presented to you. You have similar patients who have the similar kind of pain response to most humans, where they get a needle and to their skin and they feel pain. And sure enough, you can see that the participant rates them as probably having more personal distress. They have more empathic concern for them. They feel that that person must feel sadder because of that pain. And then you can see that for dissimilar people, the people who have that response of they feel pain when a cotton bud is applied to their skin, that they actually rate that as being highly painful. Okay, so they're properly figuring out, they have the right perspective taking going on here of which of these two things causes them pain. They match it up appropriately, so they're following the instructions really well. They understand the differences between the two groups. But what actually happens there in terms of mu suppression? Now, the idea here is that, again, if you have like mirror neurons up there, you have some sort of mirror neuron system, and you see someone feeling pain who's similar to you, and you can identify with them because you're experiencing the same thing, then you should show mu suppression when you are actually experiencing pain as well in your head. Okay, like if you can identify with them, the more pain that they're experiencing, the more you're going to be stimulating that in your head the same way, and you're going to get mu suppression then. There won't be as much of that big mu activity going on. All right, so here's what the mu suppression activity look like. The more that the bar is going down, the more the mu is being suppressed. And that would mean then that that part of the brain is becoming more activated, more active, right? And you can see that when they are looking at similar patients, and the similar patient just has a cotton bud put it to their skin, they don't show any mu suppression there. They're going to still show not as much mu suppression. They show relatively low levels of mu suppression. But when they see that that person who's similar to them is actually going to have the needle stuck into their skin, they're actually showing mu suppression, right? Because they can identify with that and they're supposedly simulating the same pain in their system, and that's why they're getting more mu suppression. But look over at the dissimilar patients, all right? The far right bar would be when a cotton bud is being presented to them. And they know that when a cotton bud is presented to that person's hand in that dissimilar patient group, that's painful to them. And so as they sort of, experience, share that, they actually show more mu suppression. That means that that part of the motor sensory strip is showing more activity. It's like maybe there's mirror neurons that are turning on. But for the dissimilar people who also have a needle presented to their skin, you can see that these participants can't help themselves, but see it as something that might be painful to them. So they actually show mu suppression to that condition as well, because the thinking is that they are still automatically seeing the fact that a needle is being put to the skin. And as they try to simulate that, even though they can tell themselves, hey, that doesn't hurt the person who's in this dissimilar patient group, they're relating to it as possibly painfully. And so therefore they're showing more of a pain response to that, even though they've been instructed that the person doesn't feel any such pain. So the distinction between no pain and pain happens only for people who have the similar kind of pain response to the participant, the bars that you see there on the left, where we see the differences in mu suppression. Whereas on the right, they can't really fully empathize, do emotional sharing as well here and with the dissimilar patients, so they fail to show a difference between the two types of pain that are being presented to the dissimilar patients. So that's how they showed this and tried to argue that something like mirror neurons might be involved in all this process in using mu suppression. I had a PhD student a couple years later do a similar kind of study with mu suppression that we got published, and it was sort of interesting. But I have to just say that as you read Sapolsky, you're going to see that this whole excitement that happened 10 to 15 years ago on mirror neurons has really died away. Turns out that it's just not as robust of a finding. It's not as apparent that we actually have such a system, and that maybe mirror neurons have nothing really much to do with empathy. But you can judge that yourself after you read Sapolsky's chapter. Now let's put it all together and try to understand how we would understand how experience sharing, perspective taking, and all this comes together to have us feel empathy for somebody. And so again, putting it all together this way, trying to understand how empathic concern or sympathy arises from experience sharing and perspective taking. Or if you don't even want to call it sympathy, you just want to say just generally an empathic response overall that might lead us to be more pro-social. You can look at Decety. Decety had a model that he proposed back in 2007 about how he thought all these components come together. He mentions 4 components, and we haven't talked about all of these, that he thinks dynamically interact to create the experience of empathy. So what you do is you're going to pull in that cognitive empathy, you're going to pull in the emotional empathy, comes all together. And the 4 things are: you're going to have affective sharing between the self and the other. This might be where the mirror neuron system would have come in if there is such a thing. You're going to have self-awareness. You're going to have mental flexibility to adopt the subjective perspective of the other. So this is basically like the cognitive empathy or the perspective taking. And finally, another thing we haven't really talked about is emotional regulation. So he believed that all 4 of these components would be involved in order to have an empathic experience. And so putting it all together, as he proposed it in 2007, he's talking here about some specific areas that he thought would be involved. And you can see he's making a differentiation between when you automatically sort of have this response versus when you intentionally try to have empathy. The automatic one might happen more through emotional sharing. So he's saying that if you find yourself sort of just mimicking and copying another person's behavior, that might cause you to have like automatic emotional empathy. Intentional would be where you maybe are more deliberately thinking about what they need and want to be a helpful friend or whatever it is. But either way, you can see that the 4 components I'm talking about there, we have emotional sharing that in 2007 was still maybe possibly happening in the mirror system, if there was such a thing. The limbic system, obviously, having emotions and being involved. You can see mental flexibility would include things like the MPFC, maybe the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, probably TPJ. And then we have emotional regulation, something we haven't really talked much about here. But the idea here is that you need to keep track of your sort of empathic response. You don't want to get too caught up in the emotions of feeling for the other person. So you sort of regulate yourself. You might have to tell yourself, hey, I'm going to go ahead and feel empathy for this other person's situation, but I'm not going to let it overwhelm me so that I can't go out and do the other things I need to do in my life. So you're going to use the ACC and the lateral medial prefrontal cortex to help you regulate your emotional response from all that empathy. And then finally, another component he has here is called self-awareness, which is going to involve the inferior parietal, the PFC, and the insula. And the idea is that you also need to have a sort of like idea that you're separate and different from this other person, and be aware of your emotional response, your empathic response. And so that's a fourth component that he thinks would matter here when we're talking about empathy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to some of this in the next lecture, where we look at a little bit more about different external factors that cause empathy, and we'll look to see how these different brain areas have been examined in research in the last 10-15 years in social neuroscience. So that ends this lecture. I've talked about some definitions, really basically trying to differentiate empathy and sympathy, but you can see that in the end I've started talking about empathic concern as being synonymous with sympathy. We had that big picture model. We talked about perspective taking or cognitive empathy, experience sharing or emotional empathy, and then putting it all together with Decety's neuroscience model of empathy. That's all I have for this lecture, and I look forward to talking more about empathy at the next lecture.